Welcome you all to the Swartz seminar today. And I want to make a special thanks to Vishwa and Yota, who are just masters at running a rather complex sequence of interacting humans and technologies. They've been absolutely wonderful in getting this set up, and I think maybe you don't realize it when you're sitting in the audience, but there's actually a lot of complexity in getting all of this stuff working. So thanks to both of you for making this happen. Okay, and I want to introduce, of course, today's speaker. We are fortunate to have with us today in New York City, Stefano Fusi, beaming in from his living room uptown. Stefano is a professor at Columbia University. Most of you know that. He's a member of the Theory Center up at Columbia. And he has a PhD in physics that he did at Hebrew University. I had forgotten this. It was with Shaul Hochstein and Amit. And he did a postdoc mixed partly in Bern and partly at Brandeis, working with our own Xiaojing Wang and also with Larry Abbott. And he bounced around a little bit for a couple of years after that and landed then at Columbia, where he's been ever since. That was 2007, I think, when he started as a faculty member. And Stefano works, I would say, loosely speaking, in learning and memory, and his work is characterized, as you're about to hear, if you don't already know, by a very beautiful mix of abstract and very fundamental thinking, often very high-dimensional thinking, mixed with testable experimental predictions and actual interactions with data. And I think this is not only to be commended, I think it is really an archetype for how we should be doing computational neuroscience. I think it's absolutely fabulous work. And I'll shut up now so that you can actually hear from him, which is what we're all here for. So thank you for joining us, Stefano, and we're looking forward to your talk.
All right, thank you so much, Aero, for the very kind introduction. And as you mentioned, I really value my collaborations with the experimentalists, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. It's really something that started a very long time ago with Daniel Salzman. And now we have these beautiful results on the data that was collected by Silvia Bernardi and Jerome Munuera in the Salzman lab. And I want to acknowledge also, Marcus Benna and Mattia Rigotti. Marcus is now at UCSD, he's a faculty there. Mattia is an independent researcher at IBM, and they really gave a very important contribution, fundamental contribution to the development of the theoretical framework for this paper. I want to mention also briefly that this is a very conceptual seminar. I'm going to focus on the main ideas and, of course, on the data that inspired all this. But now we are working with a lot of other groups, and I have here a partial list of the main collaborators that are doing a very similar analysis. And I can tell you that we see a very similar geometry to what I'm going to present today in all these other data sets. And this includes Rus Becchiani at NYU, and we have a grant together, and we are working exactly on the same thing, but on his beautiful data set. Okay, so let me start immediately with the conceptual part. Okay, so let's say that you live in this MNIST land. I guess you're all familiar with the MNIST dataset. It's these handwritten digits. So this is a very boring and simple word where the only thing that you see are these handwritten digits. And actually, you don't even see all of them, but you see only 4 digits, 1s, 2s, 3s, and 4s. Okay, so now, if you live in this world, you might realize that there are certainly some kind of regularities. If you have the right representations of these visual stimuli, you might realize that there are good reasons for grouping together all the ones. They probably share something, and this will help you, for instance, in a reinforcement learning task where actually the identity of the digit is important. So there might be other kind of groupings that you want to encode in your neural representations. And today we are going to focus on cognitive processes. So I'm going to consider another kind of grouping that is a little more abstract, which is when you pull together all the digits that are odd. Okay, I'm not talking here about mathematical properties. I'm really talking about these handwritten digits. So somebody should come and tell you that these guys should go together. And I'm not going to talk about this process, how you learn that they should go together. But what I want to talk about is the different ways that you can represent the fact that the ones and the threes belong to the same group, the same category of odd digits. And of course, you know, you're going to have another group, which is for the even digits. Okay, so let's say that now you look inside your brain, you live in this MNIST land, and you want to know what kind of representations you might have of this concept, which is parity, whether a digit is odd or even. So we are going to consider this space. This is the firing rate space. So along each axis, you have the firing rate of an individual neuron. This is neuron 1, neuron 2, neuron 3. I guess you see my cursor. Okay, I assume you do. So you have F1, F2, and F3. Of course, in general, you're going to have thousands or hundreds of thousands of neurons, so you have a very high dimensional space that I cannot visualize. But keep in mind that these simple examples should not be taken too seriously. Okay, so now let's say that you live in this very simple world, you're exposed to one of these digits, and then you record the activity from these neurons. That would correspond to one point in the firing rate space. Okay, so let's say this point here would correspond to a digit 1. Okay, so now you can repeat the experiment and do it for all possible different digits. And here I'm going to represent only the centroids of the representations of all these different digits. So you have to imagine that around each point you have a cloud of points that correspond to all the different specific instances of 1s, 2s, 3s, and 4. Okay, so let me consider this simple situation. This is one particular representation. So the representation, you know, is related to the geometry of, which is the arrangement of these points in the firing rate space. And in this simple example, I'm going to consider the situation in which you have a random set of firing rates for each centroid. So, you know, you take 3 random numbers, that would be the centroid for all the ones. Then another 3 random numbers, it would be the centroid for 2, and then for 3 and 4. Okay. So if you have these random representations in a high dimensional space, then you're going to have that these points define a solid that has the maximal dimensionality, that in this case is 3. So in this case, it's defining a tetrahedron. And you see here, I'm highlighting the 2 categories I care about, which is the odd digits that are in red and the even digits that are in blue. Okay, so, you know, you can say that here, basically you have a unique representation for each digit. And parity, in a sense, is represented. Because, for instance, you can train a linear decoder to separate the odd digits from the even digits. Okay, so for instance, linear decoder would be equivalent graphically here to draw an hyperplane, that in this case is just a plane, that separates all the digits that belong to one category to the digits that belong to the other category. So you can clearly separate 1, 3 from 2, 4. Okay? So you have a representation of parity. Now, what we really care about is whether this representation is abstract or not. And I'm going to make a few considerations to actually convince you that in this case you don't really have something that we could call an abstract representation of parity. So the reason is that for these kind of representations, all the possible dichotomies or ways of dividing the points into 2 groups are pretty much equivalent. You can separate the points in any way you like. So for instance, here I'm separating 1, 2 from 3, 4. Okay, so that would correspond to a different variable or a different concept. Let's say magnitude, that in this very simple case where you have only 4 digits, means separating all instances of 1 and 2, which correspond to small digits, to the instances of 3 and 4, that would correspond to large digits. But again, you can separate the points in any way you like for all possible dichotomies. So if you want to characterize this aspect of the geometry, you can introduce a quantity that essentially summarizes what I told you in words. And in order to do that, you're going to list all possible dichotomies that are not that many when you have 4 different points. So the first one is when you separate 1, 3 from 2, 4. That has a name, it's parity. 1, 2 from 3, 4, that would be magnitude. And then there could be other ways that don't have a name, but they're still dichotomies. They still correspond to some kind of concept. Okay, so now I can train a linear decoder for each of these dichotomy and see the performance. Can I separate the points or not? And in this particular case, it's easy to imagine all these hyperplanes, and it's easy to realize that you can separate all the possible dichotomies. So I'm going to call the average performance over all these dichotomies of a linear decoder a shattering dimensionality. So this is something that we introduced, not with this name, but we introduced it in an old paper in 2013, where we actually analyzed the different data set, and we showed that we have the maximal shattering dimensionality in prefrontal cortex. Okay, so in this case, the average performance is 1, because we can separate all possible dichotomies. So the shattering dimensionality will also be 1. Okay, so this is telling you that the dichotomy parity has nothing special here for this geometry. So if we want to make it special, we need to change the arrangement of these points. Now, let's say I really want to build something that we can legitimately call an abstract representation of parity. So if you look at the Merriam-Webster, one possible definition of abstract is disassociated from any specific instance. So let's try to take this seriously. What does it mean in terms of geometry? So it basically means that you discard all the information except what encodes parity. So basically, you're going to have 2 clusters. Let's say we have clusters because we have anyway noise, so they're not identical. But 1 and 3 are going to be very close to each other. 2 and 4 are going to be very close to each other because they belong to the same groups. So you have these 2 clusters. Now, of course, now you can use a linear decoder to separate the points that correspond to odd digits and even digits, as in the previous case. But you can do more. And this is what is really important for us for defining the characteristics of a geometry that is abstract. And in this particular case, you have that the shattering dimensionality is relatively low. So we have only 4 points, and basically you can separate the points in only one way. So it would be much closer to 0.5 if you had more points. In this case, it's slightly above chance, but it's only because you have one dichotomy that you can decode. However, again, you have this nice property, which is, for us, the defining characteristic of an abstract representation, which is the ability to generalize to a novel situation. So here we don't really have a novel situation. Okay, we are given this representation and we want to say something about it. So what we can do is to create a novel situation for the decoder. So what we do is the following. Let's say we train a decoder to report the parity of a digit, to report whether it's odd or even, on a subset of digits. So only 1 and 2. And now we want to know whether this would generalize to 3 and 4. So the decoder has never seen 3 and 4, but the points are arranged in a way, in a particular way, that actually allows a decoder to generalize very nicely. Okay, so train a decoder on 1 and you get this hyperplane. It's slightly different from the one that we have on the left. That would be traditional decoding. And then you test it on 3 and 4. And in this particular case, of course, it's going to work. Okay? So this is what we call cross-condition generalization. You train the decoder on a subset of conditions, and you test it on a different subset of conditions. And for us, it's the defining characteristic of an abstract representation. Now, we're using this definition because we don't want to restrict ourselves only to this extreme case where you discard all the irrelevant information, because you have these very high-dimensional spaces. You can do a lot of things in these high-dimensional spaces. You don't want to encode only one variable. And there are other cases where you can get this cross-condition generalization that are not so extreme. Okay, so let me just, because this is a very important point, let me go back for a second to this high-dimensional representation. Okay, so these are really low-dimensional. They're basically one-dimensional. Okay? So it's the number of minimal number of dimensions you need to describe these geometries. And in this case, you just need one line that is properly aligned with these two different clusters. So in this other case, you have the maximal dimensionality. You can separate the points in any way you like. But you do really bad at cross-condition generalization because there is nothing pulling together the ones and the twos. These correspond to different representations. They would be at some random location in space. So you train a linear decoder on 1 and 2, and then there's no reason why 3 and 4 should be on the correct side of this hyperplane because they will be at random positions. So it will be a chance level. Okay, so it's very different. Okay, so basically, these are the two extremes. On the one hand, we have these high-dimensional representations, maximal shattering dimensionality that gives you a lot of flexibility. You can really learn to separate the points in any way you like, but very low cross-condition generalization performance. On the other hand, when you discard all the information about the other variables that is now parity, you have maximal cross-condition generalization performance, but your shattering dimensionality is low. Okay, so, I'm going to fill this gap here, and I'm going to show you that in the representations that were recorded in the Salzman's lab, we're actually in the middle. Okay, so first of all, let me consider this kind of representations. These representations, you have that basically you have multiple variables that can be represented in an abstract format, or in other words, that have this nice property of cross-condition generalization. So let's say that you do some clustering, but in subspaces. So for instance, in this simple example, you have one neuron that cares only about magnitude, and another neuron, this here along the z-axis, that cares only about parity. Okay? So then you're going to have an intermediate dimensionality. You don't have 1, you don't have 3. In this particular case, you have just 2. So the points that correspond to the 4 different cases will be at the vertices of a square. So you have a 2D structure in this case. Now, this is a very nice factorized representation, and you still have this cross-condition generalization performance. So if you train a decoder on 1 and 2, this is the hyperplane you're going to get, and that will generalize right away to 3 and 4, which is the property that essentially tells us that parity is a bit special. It's different from the other dichotomies. Now, this is true also for magnitude. Okay, I can train a decoder to report the magnitude of the digit on, let's say, only the odd digit, so 1 and 3, and that would work also for the even digits right away without any retraining. And somehow this is a novel situation for this decoder. Okay, now there is one problem with these representations, which is that we never see these perfectly factorized representations where each neuron encodes only one variable in the brain. However, you have to consider that you can actually create a different type of representation that I'm going to discuss in a second that is compatible with the data. Before that, I forgot to mention that there is a very beautiful, important work in the machine learning community. There's a lot of work about these factorized or disentangled representations. Now, very often they are created with variational autoencoders or with some variations of the variational autoencoders. And they allow you to discover interesting structure in the world. So, for instance, this is from Irina Higgins' lab at DeepMind. They show a very large number of chairs, all different styles, different rotations, different width, and then you can see that basically these variational autoencoders can automatically detect what the relevant factors are. So they would be represented along these different axes. So for instance, let's say here along this axis, you have the leg style, along this other axis, you have the azimuth. And then you can cross-generalize. So for instance, you can train a decoder to decode the leg style on these two chairs. And as soon as you see the chairs that are rotated, you can generalize right away, even if you've never seen them. And these are particularly useful representations, not only because they're interpretable, but they allow you also to generate stimuli with very similar properties. So, this would be very similar to what I'm discussing here. Okay, now the problem with these representations is that we don't see these neurons that are highly specialized that encode only one variable. However, you have to consider that if you take these objects, this square, and you rotate it in your original high-dimensional space, you still preserve all the generalization properties you care about, in particular the cross-condition generalization performance. It's just a linear transformation, so it's guaranteed that it's going to work right away. So this would be an interesting representation, and actually this is much closer to what we see in the brain. Okay? So this would be the cross-condition generalization. Okay, now there is only one problem with this. As I mentioned, these kind of representations are relatively low dimensional, so it's difficult to separate the points in all possible ways. You have to sacrifice something. Okay? So for instance, here I'm highlighting a grouping that corresponds to the famous exclusive OR problem that is inherently nonlinearly separable. So when you have this kind of low dimensional structure, this square, you will not be able to separate the mid-range digits, so the 2 and 3, from 1 and 4. Okay, this is equivalent to the exclusive OR problem. Okay, so now we have something intermediate here. There is still an empty spot here, so you can guess that I'm going to talk about another representation. But this one is already not such a bad compromise. You can represent a number of abstract variables that can be as large as the number of neurons. In this case, I have 2, parity and magnitude. And you have some intermediate value for the shattering dimensionality. The only problem is that when you scale up the number of points or scale up the complexity of your task, the shattering dimensionality will go down exponentially fast. So in this case, it's not so bad, but because you basically have only one dichotomy that you cannot decode. But when you have a large number of points, this compromise is not going to be that good. Okay, so now let's say you start from this low dimensional structure, from the square, and now you introduce these perturbations. Okay, so you distort this square. Now you can see that you can also separate the last one. And the interesting thing is that you still able to do cross-condition generalization, as shown here. But at the same time, you are also going to be able to separate the points in any way you like. And this is illustrated in these simulations, where you progressively increase the displacement magnitude. You start from a square, and then you introduce these perturbations. And of course, the cross-condition generalization performance goes down because you're moving toward a higher dimensional representation. Now, the shattering dimensionality starts relatively high because this is a simple case, and it goes up very rapidly. Now, the interesting thing of these very simple simulations is that there is a regime where you have a really good compromise. Okay, so this is just a very simple distortion of this low dimensional structure that allow you to have both high shattering dimensionality and high CCGP. Okay. So, this is something that I would place here, and I will try to convince you that this is what we see in the real data. Okay, so this is a good time to stop for a second, and if you have any question about the conceptual part, please go ahead. Okay, so it looks like it's clear enough, and so we can continue. Okay, so now let's see what happens in the real brain, because it's really interesting. Also because, these entangled representations have a lot of nice properties, but it's unclear what they're useful for in real-world applications. So if we can get some inspiration from what happens in the real brain, that might help also to design better systems. Okay, so now let's say that I'm going to consider the experiment that I did in the Salzman's lab. So there is a task. The monkeys are trained on this task, and they are trained to start a trial by holding a bar. They actually have to press a button. I already have these slides, so I didn't want to change them, but they press a button as it's written in the paper. Okay, so then a stimulus appears on the screen very briefly. It's a fractal, it's totally meaningless. And the monkeys are trained to respond by releasing the bar to this particular stimulus. If they do so, they get a liquid reward. Now, there are 4 possible different stimuli, and the monkey has to learn all these visual motor associations. So has to respond by releasing a bar to A and C and keep holding to B and D. If it does the right thing, it gets a reward in the case of A and B, and it doesn't get anything in the case of C and D, but it avoids a timeout, which is a punishment somehow for the monkey. They hate it, so they try to avoid it as much as possible. So they're still motivated to perform the task, also in this case. So this is a nice task. We have 4 stimuli, 2 possible motor responses, and 2 possible outcomes. So a lot of variables, a lot of different conditions. Now, the interesting part, which is more cognitive and more related to our interest in these abstract representations, is that at some point, without any warning, we change the rules of the game. So the monkey is still presented with the same stimuli, same fractals, but now the monkey has to respond in a different way to all the different stimuli. So, the monkey used to respond by releasing a bar to A, now it has to keep holding. And also the outcomes are going to be different. You see all these outcomes and motor responses are kind of orthogonal. Okay, so they kept switching between these 2 contexts multiple times. So the monkeys are really overtrained. They know that their world is very simple. They're either in context 1 or in context 2. And so they can also do some inference. Every time we switch from one context to another, the monkeys cannot know that we changed the rules. So they're going to make a mistake the first time they're presented a stimulus in the new context. There's no contextual cue. However, now they can infer that the context has changed for all the stimuli. So the very first time you present A in the new context, in a sense, it's a novel situation. And the monkey knows that it has to respond by releasing the bar. It shouldn't give the response that the monkey was giving in the previous context. Okay, it's a very simple form of inference, but at least this rules out the possibility that the monkey is relearning the associations every time, because otherwise this would not be possible. Okay, so now let's look inside the brain. So they recorded the activity from 3 different brain areas. Actually, they recorded from 5 different brain areas, but we're still working on 2 of them. Takes really long time to do all this analysis. Okay, so today I'm going to focus on hippocampus, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and ACC. So these are all the neurons that have been recorded across multiple sessions and across 2 different monkeys for all the different 8 conditions, and each row is a different neuron. So here they are sorted to try to highlight any kind of clusters of responses that are similar, and this is just to show you that it's a kind of hopeless. I mean, you have a huge diversity of responses, which is what we always see in all these data sets. However, it's not hopeless to say something about these representations if you do the right analysis and if you look at these neurons at the population level. And that's what we're going to do in the rest of the seminar. Okay, so the first thing I want to know is whether context, it's one of the most interesting variables here, is encoded at all in these areas that are targeting. And the answer is yes, it's encoded, and it's actually very strongly encoded. So here we used a linear decoder, and we are decoding context as a function of time. This is when the stimulus is presented here in the three different areas. So in all these three different areas, the decoding accuracy is pretty high, even in the interval preceding the stimulus, which is when presumably the monkey has to represent this information in order then to combine it with the stimulus when it appears. Again, there is no contextual cue, so the monkey has to internally represent the context. Okay, so the context is represented because we can decode it. However, as I was stressing at the beginning, the fact that you can decode a variable doesn't tell you anything about abstraction. You really want to know whether context is represented in this special way, in this abstract format. Okay, so let's look at the geometry, because the geometry is really interesting. And actually, you know, this kind of analysis, although it's not conclusive at all, for a couple of reasons that I'm going to mention, it's really instructive. So what we did here is to take all the 650 neurons that they recorded from the hippocampus, and then project these high-dimensional representations on only 3 dimensions. We used MBS. Okay, so now don't take this too seriously, capture something like 80% of the variance, but it's anyway instructive to look at this. And then I'll show you that we did the quantitative analysis is all done in the original high-dimensional space. But it's nice to see these representations. Okay, so we have 4 conditions per context. And this is the activity in the interval preceding the presentation of the stimulus. So these are the conditions of the previous trial, not of the current trial. There's nothing on the screen when they recorded this activity. Okay, so you see A, B, C, and D are the stimuli, and H and R correspond to the actions that the monkey did in the previous trial, and plus and minus is whether the monkey got a reward or not. And I'm highlighting the cases in which the monkey got a reward. Okay, so now if you look at the hippocampus, you see some interesting structure here. So it seems like clustering, first of all. Okay, so these 4 points seem to be close to each other. And also these 4 points seem to be close to each other, and they correspond to context 1 here on the left, context 2 on the right. But there is a lot more than that. Let me rotate this. Okay, so now you can see that there is a very interesting structure. So the first thing that you can notice is that you have these 2 low-dimensional manifolds, these 2 planes that are almost parallel to each other. The second thing is that you see a very nice arrangement of the different conditions. So for instance, you see that all the rewarded cases are on the same side of this object that you have in this 3D space. Okay, so that indicates that you probably have multiple variables that are in an abstract format. Okay, this is dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Now, this is interesting because if you really believe only in clustering, actually you can do a cluster analysis here, and it would not pass your test. So you would conclude that actually they're not clustered. And the reason is that, you know, these distances here within each context are larger than the distances across context. However, you see, again, this very nice structure where you basically have these 2 parallel planes, and you see also the nice arrangement of the points. Okay, but you know, this is to warn you that you cannot just do some kind of clustering analysis because then you would not be able to detect this beautiful structure. Okay, finally, in ACC, you see again these 2 low-dimensional manifolds are kind of parallel, They're not really perfectly two-dimensional. And then again, you see this a nice arrangement of all the yellow points that correspond to the cases in which the monkey was rewarded. Okay, so let's try to be more quantitative. Now, we had 8 different conditions. So this would correspond to all the 8 points that I was showing you in the previous representations. And now I want to do the analysis, the cross-condition generalization, is something we can measure in the data, in a totally unbiased way. So I don't want to make assumptions about the variables that are actually encoded in this special format. I want to identify them from the data. So what I'm going to do is basically to consider all possible dichotomies of these 8 different conditions. So yeah, sure.
Can I just chime in? There are 2 questions. There's one from much earlier that I missed, but I thought I should chime in with the 2 that are on the screen relevant to your current location in the talk. The first one is from Christina 7. Is the decoding done from pseudo-populations or simultaneously recorded neurons?
Yeah, from pseudo-population.
Okay. And the second question, thank you. And the second question is from Christine Constantinople. On the error trials, does the geometry suggest that the monkey thinks that they are in the other context?
No. Not really. So we analyzed the error trials. I don't have a slide, but it's in the paper. And what happens is that you can decode context almost with the same accuracy as you do in the correct trials. However, I'll show you later that the cross-condition generalization performance is higher in the correct trials than in the error trials. That seems to be one of the aspects of the geometry that changes, but not the ability to decode the correct context. So there is something that certainly changes in the geometries, but it's not a simple decoding accuracy.
Thanks.
Okay, so this is one way of dividing the 8 conditions into 2 groups. So it corresponds to one dichotomy, context 1 versus context 2. But it's not the only one. So, this is context. You have these other ways where I'm grouping together all the conditions in which the monkey was rewarded, comparing them to all the conditions in which the monkey was not rewarded. So I would call this variable value, for instance. And there are also other ways that don't make much sense, like grouping together stimulus A and B. So this doesn't really have a name, but it's one possible dichotomy. So, in our case, we have 8 points, and the total number of balanced dichotomies is only 35. We can do the full analysis for all the possible dichotomies. Okay, so let me show you the results of this analysis. Let me first focus on this time interval preceding the presentation of the stimulus. Okay, so this is a very rich plot, so it will take some time to explain it. So here we have the 3 brain areas we focused on in the paper. And you see you have empty circles and filled circles. So the empty circles correspond to the decoding accuracy for all the 35 possible dichotomies. So each of these corresponds to a different variable. Okay? And the same for CCGP. Each of these corresponds to a different variable. So the first thing that you can notice, then I'll tell you where the interesting dichotomies are and what these dichotomies correspond to. But there's one thing to notice that is very important for us, which is that most of the empty circles are actually about chance, which means that you can really decode all possible variables. So, if you come up with a crazy idea and say, oh, these monkeys are encoding whether the stimulus is A, B, or C, D, you can decode it. It's certainly there. Okay? However, not all of these variables that can be decodable are represented in an abstract format. They're in this spatial format. So now, this is just to tell you that the fact that you can decode the variables with this high accuracy corresponds to a shattering dimensionality that is relatively high. In this case, you see these are the numbers. And I'll come back to this in a second. But before discussing the shattering dimensionality, let me show you some of the interesting dichotomies. So one is context. Okay, I want to know if context is represented in an abstract format. So it's certainly decodable from all the different brain areas, as I was showing you at the beginning, but it is also in an abstract format, despite the fact that, again, you don't have any clustering. Okay? So in particular, in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, it's clearly about chance. It's very well about chance. Okay, another variable that is represented in an abstract format is the value of the previous trial. Okay, again, this is the interval preceding the stimulus, and it's very similar to actually the interval then and it's following the stimulus. Okay, so here you see that value is strongly encoded in all the three brain areas, and it's also in an abstract format. Now, action is probably the most interesting one because it's in an abstract format in prefrontal cortex, but not in the hippocampus. Okay, and we don't really understand why. We have a few hypotheses in the discussion, but it's interesting that you have situations, and we will see another one that is much more prominent than this, where you have the difference between what you might detect with the analysis of the decoding accuracy and what you can get by looking at the cross-condition generalization performance. Okay, so now let me go back for a second to the shattering dimensionality. So you might wonder, is this a high value or a low value? The problem is that this would certainly be a very high value in the case in which we had, let's say, a very large number of conditions. But we have a finite number of conditions, 16. It's possible that just by chance, you would observe this value, even if you have a perfectly factorized representation. So what we want to discriminate is between this scenario on the left and this scenario on the right, where you have these distortions that would enable you to have more dichotomies that are decodable. Okay? So it's possible that with noise, you start from this perfectly factorized representation, and you have a finite number of points. You can do significantly better than 0.5. Okay, so what we did was to build a perfectly factorized representation. So we start from something like this. Okay, this is again the simple example in the MNIST world, but imagine this with 8 points that correspond to the 8 different conditions. So we place them on a cube, not on a square, and then we tuned all the sides of the cube in order to reproduce the observed cross-condition generalization performance. Okay, so then we have something that is similar to the geometry of the real data, but by construction, now these representations are perfectly factorized. Okay, so in this simple example, we would tune these two sides to reproduce the cross-condition generalization performance. Now, in the experiment, this is what we did. So let's start from the hippocampus. We built this cuboid, and then we tune the sides to reproduce the cross-condition generalization performance for all the 3 variables simultaneously. So this would be context, action, and value. And each dot corresponds to a different realization of this null model of a perfectly factorized representation. Okay, so now this is the shattering dimensionality that you would get from this perfectly factorized representation. And this is the observed one. And at least for this very simple null model, we see that it's highly different. It's certainly significantly different. So basically, this is telling us that even in this case where the shattering dimensionality is a kind of intermediate, it's probably significantly different from what you would get from a perfectly factorized representation. Okay, so it's even more so in the other 2 brain areas where the shattering dimensionality is more elevated, and it would pass at least our statistical test, which is not the only possible one, admittedly, but at least this convinced us that there is something a little different from a perfectly factorized representation. Okay, now let's look at what happens during the trial when we follow over time a few different quantities and the geometry of the representations. So this is just a decoding accuracy. This is the first thing we need to do because we need to know whether the variables are encoded or not. And then we are going to look at the geometry more closely by doing all the other analysis. Okay, so here we are decoding value now of the current trial, not of the previous trial, as a function of time. And time 0 is the time at which the stimulus is presented. So it goes up rapidly in all the 3 brain areas with some delay in the hippocampus. And also action goes up. Now it's interesting that value goes up more rapidly than the action. So, somehow the monkey is thinking earlier about the outcome than about the action it has to perform in order to get the reward or not get the reward. Anyway, so this is just to identify the next time interval we're going to focus on, which is the time interval where we can already decode all these different variables. So instead of this, now we're going to consider this other time interval. Okay, so this is not during the delay. The stimulus is still on the screen, and now the firing rates are much higher. So what you can see here is, again, the same plot. And you see now the decoding accuracy in all the 3 brain areas is much higher. It's around 0.9. This is cross-validated performance. So it's pretty good for this kind of data. And it's pretty high for basically all the different dichotomies. And there is a big gap between the lowest one and chance level. Okay, so now we can do the analysis also for cross-condition generalization performance. And you see that context, value, and action are all in this abstract format with one very notable exception, which is context in prefrontal cortex. Because in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, it's very strongly encoded, but it's not in an abstract format. And in ACC, it's really at the edge. Okay, so it's slightly significant, but it's certainly much weaker than in the hippocampus. We don't really know why this happens. We wish we could do, the analysis that we really wanted to do, which is the one of analyzing the interval between the time we can decode the stimulus that I don't have here on this plot and the time we can decode the decision of the monkey. That would be the interesting one. And in that time, we know that you really need the maximal dimensionality. So it's possible that temporarily, although the shattering dimensionality is already elevated, you need even more. And that's why in the brain area where you make the decision, which is most likely dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and you see here it's also the first one that goes up, you have that your geometry changes, and it goes into this different state where the context is not in an abstract format any longer. Okay, so shattering dimensionality, here it's really high. So you probably don't even need to do the analysis, but we did it anyway. And of course, it's highly significant also in this case. So there is really no doubt that in this case, we don't have a perfectly factorized representation with some noise. Okay, so the last 5 minutes, I want to tell you something about modeling work that we are doing. And we're doing now a lot of modeling work and trying to understand how we can get a similar geometry in a simulated network. So I would start with a really simple network. And again, we are back in the MNIST world now with 8 digits, as in the experiment. We had 8 conditions. And we do, again, parity and magnitude. And we're going to train a very simple network, feed-forward network with 2 hidden layers to report whether one of these handwritten digits is odd or even. Yeah. Now, since we're interested in multiple abstract variables, we're going to consider also a different dichotomy, which is magnitude, so a different way of grouping together the different digits. And the way we're going to do it is to introduce other 2 outputs that have to report the magnitude of the digit. Okay, so basically there are 2 abstract concepts that might emerge in these representations. One is parity and the other one is magnitude. Now, let's focus on the second layer. It's where actually you see this representation. So this is the MDS plot, similar to what I showed you previously. Now, we have tens of thousands of different samples, so we have a much richer representation here, but you see every point corresponds to a representation of a different digit, and the digit tells you what is the identity of the stimulus in the input. So there's a lot of variability. There is a lot of similarity structure that is inherited from the input. That's unavoidable. It's real word. It's the MNIST word. But you certainly see this very nice low-dimensional structure and 4 clusters that are pretty much at the vertices of a square. So basically, you have the parity is encoded along one direction, and magnitude is encoded along the other direction. Now, if you do the cross-condition generalization performance analysis, you see very nicely, and this is much cleaner than in the data, of course, that first of all, the decoding accuracy is really high for all possible dichotomies, and this is something that actually is much harder to understand because the network is only trained on these dichotomies that I mentioned, but it's very high, and we see that in almost every simulation. Now, the nice thing here is that you see there are only 2 dichotomies that are significantly different from chance for CCGP. And, okay, this is to say that shattering dimensionality is very high. Okay, so one is parity and the other one is magnitude. And, you know, the way we did it was really in a totally blind way. So I ran the simulations and then I got the data and gave it to Marcus Benna, and I asked him, okay, so what is that this network learned? And, you know, basically Marcus didn't know anything about the behavior of the network. He didn't have the output. He only had the geometry of the representations in this intermediate layer, which is very often what we have to do when we study these representations in the real brain. So he did the analysis in this way, which is totally unbiased, and he told me right away. So these are the 2 representations. Okay, now you might complain that this is really a simple case. We have only these 2 variables that are explicitly represented in the output. This is very different from what we did in the experiment, and you would be right. So what we did is also to simulate what happens in the experiment. So, you know, we trained a feed-forward network, so we had to introduce some information about the previous trial. Otherwise, there's no way at all that a monkey can perform this task. And then we did it in a supervised way where the output has to report the action and the expected value. And we got this very similar geometry. So this is the case, you know, multiple runs of the experiment and of the simulations, and you see that in most of the cases you get a very high cross-condition generalization performance that is higher than chance for context, value, and action. But we did it also with reinforcement learning. So, you know, we took inspiration from this beautiful work that now became very popular, and we used deep Q learning to train a network to do exactly the same task that the monkey did. And you know, this is a little more complicated to explain, but you can find all the details in the paper. And also in this case, we see a very similar geometry. Although, you know, in this case, we had to introduce another element in the output, which is basically the reconstruction of the input. Otherwise, if you don't encourage the network to do that, you don't represent value and action of the previous trial so strongly as in the experiment. And we believe this could be very important, and it could be actually the role of the hippocampus. Okay, so let me conclude. So we certainly see that there are multiple abstract variables in all the areas we studied, in all the data sets, because this is not the only data set that we analyzed, but you know, there's no way I can tell you also about the other data sets. It's interesting that both cross-condition generalization performance, that for us is the signature of an abstract representation, and the shattering dimensionality are both elevated. You know, this makes our work compatible with what we've seen in the past, where the shattering dimensionality was also very high. And at the same time, it tells us that maybe this is an interesting regime for operating. We have a totally unbiased method for identifying the abstract variables, and that's something we are using in a lot of data sets. And we are discovering a lot of interesting things, that variables that we would never expect to be represented in an abstract format, that were actually the real variables that somehow were encoded by the animal. And the other variables we had in mind were just correlated in a complicated way to these variables. And similar abstract representations can be observed in simulations of artificial neural networks, but you had to use our analysis. If you try to map individual neurons to individual factors, you will never see that in this kind of very simple feed-forward networks. Okay, so thanks a lot for attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
Well, I can step in and ask some people's questions for them. There was a quick question from Will Durrell. When you do the decoding analysis with the network trained on MNIST, are you decoding from all neurons?
I am decoding from all neurons, yes. Basically, I'm considering all the neurons in the last layer. I mean, the information is highly distributed, and you can take any subset of neurons and you would have a very similar performance. It's a relatively simple task. You can also try to find neurons that are more specialized than others, that just by chance they are a little more aligned to the factors. You can ablate them and look at the cross-condition generalization performance. And when you ablate them, or you ablate other neurons that encode multiple variables, you actually see very similar, sometimes identical decrease in the cross-condition generalization performance. This is telling us that by chance you have some of these neurons that are aligned to the factors, or at least partially aligned to the factors, but you don't really need to rely on them. You can essentially count on all these others because they are equally representing this nice low-dimensional structure that defines these variables in an abstract format.
There's a question from Vishwa, one of our hosts, who's kind of running the show in the background. And Vishwa wants to know, why do you believe that HPC is the source of encoding action and value from the previous trial, rather than working memory in PFC?
Well, it is both. I mean, it's not that the two things are mutually exclusive. It's just that we have a different work about our model of the hippocampus, and we took inspiration from many ideas that have been around for a long time that assume that the hippocampus is basically a sparse autoencoder that compresses the information before it's actually stored in the cortex. And we think that this is a very good description of what happens in a lot of data sets, including the data sets in which these animals they are recording from are, for instance, exploring an environment. So if you make this assumption, you get, for instance, place cells in a very natural way. For this reason, we think that we need this. Let me see. I can go back. We need this reconstruction of the input. That is basically what you would put into an autoencoder. And one possible candidate is the hippocampus, for all these other reasons, for our general model of the hippocampus. Of course, we don't have any evidence, and we're trying now to study a model where we have essentially two different pathways, one that would represent the hippocampus and the other one, the prefrontal cortex, and see under some minimal assumptions whether we can get some of the features that we observe in the experiments.
Here's a question from Brendan that actually came up in the discussion during the Journal Club earlier. And I think it's something that people often wonder about, so it's probably worth commenting on. Is there experimental evidence showing that regions downstream of cortex are operating as linear decoders?
Yeah, so that's something that a lot of people ask me. And so first of all, I mean, for us, we just need to make an assumption. We need to consider a decoder that is not too complicated, that somehow constrains the kind of representations that you can have in the input. So that's why we picked the linear decoder. But the linear decoder is certainly something that an individual neuron can probably implement. So that's one reason. The second reason is that in our 2013 paper on Nature, we analyzed Miller's data, and we showed that essentially a linear decoder can predict the behavior of the monkey, whereas a nonlinear decoder would not. So it's possible that prefrontal cortex is one of the last stages, if not the last one, where the decision is made. And at some point, you need these representations to be linearly separable. And that's probably why we have the shattering dimensionality is so high, and why we have this nice correlation between behavior and dimensionality. And there are many other papers that now report a similar correlation between behavior and dimensionality.
I'm going to go with questions. Just for the audience's sake, I'm partly making choices here based on votes. So if you want, you look at the list of questions and there's something you would like to hear an answer to, please vote for it, and that will affect my sequence of choosing here. Okay, there are quite a few votes for Guki Okazawa's question. He wants to know, he says, I understand the benefits of abstract encoding of the task-related variables, but what is the benefit of having the higher shattering dimension beyond the task-relevant variables in this case?
Yeah, so especially in the simulations, there is really no advantage. And that's why we're struggling to understand it. Now, I think in the brain, it makes sense because the same brain area performs a lot of different, very diverse tasks. And so you need some flexibility in terms of representation to give different responses in different contexts, in different tasks. So a high shattering dimensionality would certainly give you that. In the case of the simulations, we are still trying to understand it. And it's probably inherited from the initial conditions that are the random conditions, which are already sufficient to give you a pretty good high dimensional representation. But there is really no reason in that case to have that the decoding accuracy is so high for all possible dichotomies. And it's a simple consequence of the typical algorithms and the typical initial conditions that are used. And it's probably, again, useful in the case in which then at some point you want to retrain the network on a new task. So that would give you the flexibility of doing it right away without retraining all the layers of the network, simply by retraining the weights to the output.
Let's see. There was a question from very early on in the talk, and I felt badly. I didn't notice it initially. And I didn't want to ask it after the slides were passed, but let me throw it back to you now. It has to do with your early example. If instead of training on 1 and 2, one trains on 1 and 4, a hyperplane would not be parallel to the manifold. Would the CCGP be lower?
Yeah. So
it makes sense out of context because we're away from the slides now. But
okay, let me find it. It's very slow. So basically, okay, I'll get there eventually. But yeah, so you're totally right that that was a particular choice of the conditions over which we did the training and over which we did the testing. Now, in these low dimensional cases, you have all sorts of pathological situations. Okay, we're almost there. So you're totally right that in that case, if we choose 1 and 2 as we did in the example, it would work. If you choose, if you make a different choice, it would not. Getting there. So what we do normally when we do this analysis is to choose all possible ways of choosing the training conditions, and then do the same analysis, and then we take the average over all possible ways. Okay, so for instance here, okay. So you can do 1 and 2, and this would generalize to 3 and 4. It would not work if you do 1 and 4, okay? And then you try to generalize to 2 and 3, it would be a chance level. However, the average cross-condition generalization performance over all these possible choices of training conditions and testing conditions would be above chance. So it would anyway enable us to detect this low-dimensional structure. However, this is a very peculiar case because I have only 4 points here. When you have a cube and you have 16 points, sorry, you have 8 points, then let's say you pick 3 points from each context. For any choice you do, you actually can cross-generalize to the 4th one. So it's really due to the fact that in this very simple example, we have a very small number of points. As you increase the number of points, it becomes more rare the possibility that when you have a nice low-dimensional structure, then you don't cross-generalize.
There are 2 questions that have to do with training, and I'm going to loosely summarize, and they're about the differences between, let's say, supervised versus reinforcement learning versus something like an autoencoder, unsupervised. And let me read the questions themselves, but that was a little prelude. So Gino Del Ferraro asks, do you observe different abstract representations when you run simulations for a feed-forward network in contrast to reinforcement learning? And if so, what's the explanation? And a related question, I think, from Tomasz is, you focused on feed-forward networks, but do you think that the finding would also apply to autoencoders? And how important would backpropagation be in forming the representations in particular?
Yeah, so the differences between reinforcement learning and supervised learning in our simple case are really minimal. We don't really completely understand them. It's something we need to study because one of the problems of the deep Q learning is that there is a lot of variability from run to run. So that's why we decided to report the results for all the runs, because there is really a lot of variability. I mean, it's something that you would never report in an experiment if you would have such a variability across monkeys. They would never publish your paper. But the variability is huge. So it's difficult to study systematically the differences between the 2 simulations. And I should ask Mattia Rigotti who did them, but I'm not aware of any systematic study to try to identify the differences. So we just focused on the main results. We wanted to get the high CCGP for the 3 variables, and that's something we get. The other question was about feed-forward network and autoencoder, sorry. So, okay, so these are very different networks. So autoencoders, all they do is to basically reproduce the output. So they can only rely on any low-dimensional structure that is in the latent variables that are behind the inputs, essentially the structure of the input. The interesting cases for us are those that are a little more cognitive, where the structure is across the inputs and the outputs, as in the case of the experiment. And those are much more difficult to study. And we're trying to come up with a general theoretical framework to formalize what happens in the most general case, but it's not easy. And, it's something we're still working on. But, you know, in that case, of course, you know, it wouldn't make sense to consider an autoencoder because you need to consider both the input and the output. And then you can have a very different structure than in the other case. The autoencoders, of course, you know, can be very different from what we see in our simulations, mostly because they're usually constructed with something in mind. Like, you know, variational autoencoders have a very artificial structure where you want an explicit representation of the latent variables where the factors are actually perfectly aligned to the units in the latent representation. So then, of course, you expect a very specific representation in these layers, and I would say that that's not the kind of representation that we see in the brain. I mean, you see some of the neurons could be similar, but overall, you should really care about the geometry and not what individual neurons are doing.
Presumably an autoencoder only learns those things when essentially you force it to, by reducing the available resources, either the number of neurons or you add a lot of noise or something, because otherwise there's no need for it to do that just to be able to reproduce the input.
Absolutely. That's another extremely important point. Yeah, I should have mentioned that.
We get into a bottleneck of some sort.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's why I was talking about sparse autoencoders. That would be one way of introducing a bottleneck.
There you go. Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, a related question here, I'm not quite sure whether you've really covered this or not, but let me throw it in. It's from Dan Levenstein about whether the networks you are looking at really need to be able to reconstruct the input in order to get these abstract representations. What he says that you mentioned in the talk that you needed that, and could you say more why it's necessary? I'm recalling you saying that, so maybe I missed it.
Yeah. So I said it. Now it's at the very end, so it will take some time. But it's in the case of the reinforcement learning, when we analyze the representations, we saw that the cross-condition generalization performance for the action and value was much lower than in the data. So to encourage the network to represent them a little more, we introduced this reconstruction loss during training. That was the only reason. So there is no principal reason, no computational reason to do that. We just wanted to reproduce the data, and we thought we would do it in a kind of reasonable way by introducing this reconstruction loss. But that was the only
Presumably the network was losing too much information and you decided to tell it not to throw so much away.
Yeah.
Is a soft way of saying it. One last question, because we're really out of time. We should stop by 1/4 after. Dima Rinberg asks, I'm going to paraphrase his question. Basically, how does this scale with the number of objects or categories? Is this something that we should think of as realistic as you go to larger and larger numbers, or does it become quickly infeasible?
So in principle, you can have a number of factors that is as large as the number of neurons. In practice, this is not the case because you have noise and you also have this distortion in the geometry. So it would be really interesting to study what happens in terms of scaling properties. It's one of the things we are doing now. It takes ages because, when you increase the number of points to compute cross-condition generalization performance in the way we are doing in the paper, you have an exponential number of different choices for the training set and the test set. You also have an exponential number of possible novel behaviors, which is why this analysis is interesting. But yeah, it will take some time, and we are trying to find tricks to overcome this problem, these limitations.
All right. Well, we've reached the end. Thank you, Stefano, for a fabulous talk. I hope you all of the audience out there in virtual land enjoyed it. And just a quick reminder that the talks, links to the talk are available on the Swartz Seminars website and also in the Worldwide Neuro website. Those were posted in the chat earlier, but I assume that you can find them just by virtue of Google. So thank you again, Stefano.